advocate for our children in the same way that we expect them to. And I'm going to relate that to breastfeeding because this is your focus in this group, right? We know that children and that babies, if a mother can benefit from breastfeeding more than they probably do from formula. But the number one thing that we start to see, and this is across the world, is mothers being given lots of free formula. We see industries trying to make money by providing women all these alternatives that aren't necessarily in many situations needed. And in some situations, and this is in second world and third world countries, giving them so many free bottles of formula that they stop breastfeeding, and then they don't have the funds to actually buy formula, which creates a huge problem. So I'm going to start from that basis because that's my thought is, and I don't know any of you individually, probably the basis a lot of you are coming to when you're coming in and joining groups like this. And what can happen though is that the issues with motherhood don't end there. And I know a lot of you as experienced parents of multiple children start to understand that when I say the issues don't end there, the advocacy for your child has to continue on throughout the school system. The world doesn't always, and a lot of parents will, and this, when you see this in your roles as providers, a lot of parents come to this understanding where they don't take action quickly when they sense something is wrong, often because of this misconception that I think we all have in the world that someone else is advocating, someone else is looking after our child's best interests. I handle many cases involving adult children as well who enter group homes, and a parent assumes that everyone there is going to care for their adult child. I handle many wrongful death cases because of these sometimes false assumptions where we don't demand that type of accountability. So I know that Jennifer had said a lot of this is question and answer, and to the extent that I can provide any information, and it is information, it's not legal advice, about how the system works, about ways that you can advocate for parents, for other mothers, for fathers. I'm happy to provide at least my insights and my background as to things to talk to them about, to be on the lookout for, because it goes, again, our advocacy for other mothers has to go beyond those first years and into their children's later years. Many children don't talk about abuse initially when it happens. We get many cases. I'm working on one now where a child said they were abused, no one believed him, and we later were able to get video from that school system. So as to questions, I'm happy to take them and to provide some insight in at least what I do and how that can be helpful for you.
Catherine, I want to ask if you ever work, because you do personal injury sustained by children. Is that ever at birth?
In terms of medical malpractice cases, when we talk about birth-related injuries, we often refer those out to other firms and work in conjunction with them, because it's certainly hard to be a jack of all trades.
Yeah.
But if we have, for instance, a client that comes to us and wants expertise across fields, we will take a look at that case. We'll find another attorney, sometimes even depending on the state, right? To work with that family and to help them find a resolution.
Okay. And then, like, I had a son who was autistic, and he's 25 now, but the struggle to navigate the system. I mean, I was his best advocate because I was his mom and knew what I needed and what I felt like he needed. But navigating that system was an absolute nightmare. I think in the end it went really well because I'm tenacious and obnoxious, but you shouldn't have to be that tenacious and obnoxious to get your child what they need. So what recommendations do you give? I recently had a mom who had a baby born with Down syndrome. My son was autistic. I mean, those things happen. So what recommendations do you have for kind of navigating that system with disabilities?
Yeah, you're going to have to be tenacious. If you're not, yeah, if you're not, you're gonna have a lot of problems in the system. And so as far as navigating it, you've got to be really highly organized, save documents, do your own Google searches. If you get advice that you question, double check it, get second opinions, especially when it comes to the education system. Whether a child has autism, Down syndrome, a reading disability like dyslexia, often you will hear what we have is what you get. And that's really not how the law works. The educational program provided to that child needs to be comprehensive and it needs to be appropriate. For instance, that includes speech therapy, occupational therapy, for a child with autism, behavior. When I say behavior reinforcements, whether that's them bringing in a BCBA, bringing in a registered behavior technician, ensuring that we're using positive behavior strategies in the classroom. This isn't simply just about teaching reading and writing. It's about teaching communication. It's about teaching behavioral skills, positive role modeling, all of that. And I think unless you're tenacious, you're not going to get that. And many, many parents don't. They get to us sometimes after their child is 16, 17, 18, because the school has said, we're going to be giving your child a certificate of completion and transitioning them out. Many parents don't even know how long their child can stay in the school system. And in many states, it's to their 22nd birthday. And I say in many states, because in other states, it's longer. In some states it's 24, in others it's 26. And that's where you can have vocational training put in place, and all sorts of additional skill gathering. And again, that's left off. That often gets forgotten.
Definitely. It definitely did. I mean, I knew that my son could stay longer. There was a point in time though where I didn't want a 14-year-old girl starting high school in with my 21 or 22-year-old autistic son.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that that's also something you have to take into consideration. Like, I just didn't like that dynamic personally, but I didn't have a vocation option that I knew of that I could funnel him into that would have maybe made the difference, bridge that gap.
Well, and that's why schools are supposed to have what we call transition services and transition planning. And this comes from what's called the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And it's a federal law. And that transition services have to include the vocational programming. It has to include, having individuals work within the community. And so it's also calling in like vocational rehabilitation, getting groups to surround your child to help them transition to independent life. And again, these things often get forgotten, and unless parents are asking for them and really actively pushing for appropriate programs, they're not getting them. And that's not solely in the states that we focus in. It's in the states, it's across the US. And it's why parents who you work with, or who the people, your group listening, if you're at a barbecue, I know a lot of people were out this weekend and someone is telling you about their child's school or things going on, where you really need to encourage that tenacity, and them asking those questions.
I have a couple more questions, but if anybody else does, feel free to raise your hand. You have, first of all, there's a private school versus public school. Is the percentage rate about the same in disciplinary issues or issues that you have that the parents need to step in and do more? Because in my mind, I would think a private school would have a lot less conflict and disciplinary issues, but maybe that's not true.
Yeah, it depends. So public schools are the only ones that have to follow the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And a lot of the state laws simply cover the public schools. When it comes to private schools, it depends. If we're talking about a child who's struggling with learning disabilities, and things, processing speed issues, private schools can be phenomenal for parents who can afford them. The caveat being, the words "can afford them." But when it comes to children who have autism or Down syndrome or some of the more complex disabilities, a lot of the placements are extraordinarily expensive. For instance, an ABA center that is not being funded by your insurance is around $150,000 a year, unless you can get insurance to cover it, or you can get your public school system to cover it. And so, we take that a step further. Public schools are also responsible for residential placements for children who need them. So a parent who has a child who has really complex disabilities, some of these residential placements are $380,000 a year. Now, that being said, you're getting a lot of services with those placements, and often they're very good. And we don't get a lot of cases involving problems at many of these facilities, but they do happen. And that's where it really is always, crossing your eyes, or crossing your eyes, dotting your I's, crossing your T's, where you're really looking at these centers and saying, is this going to be the right place for my child? And that being said, right, we can never be entirely sure.
Nope.
Right out there in the world, I mean, something can appear perfect, and then we later, discover that there could be issues.
Yeah, I've definitely experienced that for sure. I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about like the sexual abuse, molestation, rape, and also how that ties into physical abuse. I actually got full custody of my kids years ago when they were young, but it took them 6 years to come forward and tell someone appropriate that their dad was physically abusive. So that wasn't a sexual part of it, but it was physical. And the biggest issue we had with the case is that they couldn't show marks on their body on the day that they finally broke down and reported. So that wasn't a lot of fun to go through. So I know a lot of people are working with like an ex-spouse and kids going back and forth, and maybe some physical issues there. And then we have all the sexual abuse and rape. So I guess probably two different questions about that. But how often does it come up, and what is the support there to help in those situations?
It comes up a lot, unfortunately. And children often wait to report, whether it's a girl in high school who, was in the locker room and gets sexually assaulted. For children with disabilities, unfortunately, it happens quite a bit at school. It can happen in private schools, public schools. It can happen in residential placements, and it can happen in group homes. And we handle quite a few cases like that. And most children and disabled adults don't report it the day it happens. Most of them are dealing with embarrassment, fear. They don't know what happened, why it happened. And so there's always that problem of how do we go back and not only construct what happened to this individual, but how do we then try and resolve all of it for them, and look at what they're going to need going forward. But not talking about something traumatic that's happened is extremely common. And that ranges with children who are 7 years old who get an assault at a school. And we see this with even bullying, right? A child who's being bullied relentlessly at school may and initially tell a teacher I'm being bullied. When nothing changes, there's this approach of learned helplessness. And that learned helplessness can be very, very problematic. And the child stops telling others. And sometimes things can become really, really severe. And that's where it's getting a child over that hump of feeling like that they have to keep it to themselves. And so that is one thing I always encourage, to the extent parents can, always letting that child know, please tell me things. But it's hard. I mean, there are parents I know who have actively encouraged their children to always be really open and forthright, only to find out that something really traumatic has happened to them that they didn't share initially.
I actually feel like that's more common. That's most of us, when your kids are older and they talk about like that kid that bullied them when they walked home from school and they never said a word, or, I mean, yeah, often, which is too bad. I want to switch gears and ask you about civil rights and disability claims. Is that related to like getting Social Security or being listed as having a disability?
Yes. So if a child has a disability, automatically you are considered disabled under what's called Section 504 and the ADA. And when it comes to getting Social Security disability, that's a process you actually have to go through to claim those funds. And whether you have a disability, and on the other hand, whether or not you're entitled to Social Security disability benefits, are two
Yeah.
separate
Okay.
things. So when I'm talking about civil rights law, that's often ADA, Title IX, Section 504 claims. And these are all laws that are supposed to protect individuals who are disabled, or when we talk about Title IX, protect individuals against sexual intimidation, sexual harassment. And so that's where the civil rights aspect of this comes in.
I love that. Does anybody else have any questions? I know we just did another interview, which is great.
Yeah, Jennifer Delaney.
All right. Thank you. And thank you so much. It's very informative. Okay. So I kind of have like a naive question. I feel stupid asking it, but what are the rights of children? Because I feel like rights are always given to an an adult.
Yes.
And I feel like a child has the right to safety and maybe the right to education, but I'm just curious to hear like your definition on that.
Yeah, so the rights of children, unfortunately, are very limited. And when we look at them on a state by state basis, like for instance, the right to education isn't in every state. There's a right to education in California. It's actually included in the California Constitution. In other states, there is no right to education, which is why a school system can expel a child for 12 months, sometimes 24, and provide them no educational services. So when we talk about the rights of children, most of those rights have to be pursued by their parents. And that's why our system, we have to really encourage parents to be very, very active, right? Because, for instance, a right of a child in a public school system for an appropriate education, school is supposed to provide that. But if they don't, the only one who can pursue that on behalf of the child is either a parent, a guardian, or someone who has been given legal educational decision-making authority. So if that child is not getting speech therapy, they're not getting occupational therapy, they're not being provided reading services, the child on their own doesn't really have much of a recourse. It's the parents who have to act as those private attorney generals. When it comes to child abuse and that type of thing, that's where, again, the state agencies, like depending on the state you're in, the Department of Child Services, Child Protection Services, different states, they call them different names. Certainly there are criminal statutes against child abuse. And that's where we have guardian ad litems who step in, Department of Child Services, police enforcement. But remember, those are sort of criminal statutes. That's not necessarily the right of the child. And so that's where advocacy for children becomes really essential, right? Because they are not their own voice. They absolutely depend on those around them for the enforcement of education laws, the enforcement of criminal laws. And that's, again, where I used that word that Jennifer Campbell started off with, was being tenacious. Parents really have to be tenacious. Otherwise, the rights of the children really aren't going to be enforced.
Thank you so much. Holy cow. It was great to see you. And thanks for chatting. Does anybody else have any questions? We finished all the business, all the questions, had a great speaker, and we're done early. Woohoo.
All right. Thank you so much, all of you. And I wish you the best. I think what you're doing is phenomenal. Just keep at it. Thank you.